Welcome, everyone, to this exciting conversation I'm having with Dr. Lana Tatour. Before I introduce our guest today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which I am dialing in today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land, acknowledging that I am dialing in from a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 230 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I am dialing in from Camaragal country. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this exciting conversation with Dr. Lana Tatour. Dr. Lana is a senior lecturer in global development at the University of New South Wales. Her book, Race and the Question of Palestine, is forthcoming with Stanford University Press in June 2025. Dr. Lana Tatour, thank you so much for your time and welcome to this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me and for all the work that you do. And also I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from Gadigal land and also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And I want to express my deep gratitude to all the amazing solidarity that First Nations have been extending us on this continent and emphasize time and again that our liberation is connected.
Absolutely. I second that. Our liberation is one. So thank you, Lana, for this great intro. So Lana, I wanted to have a few questions with you, actually. In 2021, protests erupted by 1948 Palestinians, is what they call them, the Palestinians who live in Israel, in the state of Israel. Those protests were in solidarity with Sheikh Jarrah, which was facing an Israeli ethnic cleansing campaign and against Israeli attacks on the Al-Aqsa mosque, with demonstrations starting in Haifa and Nazareth, and it continued to spread out to many cities within the state of Israel. This also coincided with retaliation attacks by the Palestinian resistance in Gaza and within the West Bank. This movement was dubbed as the Unity Intifada back then in 2021, because it encompassed, all areas within the historic Palestine where the Palestinians lived, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in 1948 Palestinians. I couldn't help but wondering, the genocidal assault on Gaza that continued for more than 15 months, claiming hundreds of thousands of Palestinian lives and resulting in a total destruction of nearly 80% of Gaza Strip. And, the recent Trump proposed plan to ethnically cleanse, blatantly, to ethnically cleanse the residents of Gaza, did not seem to invoke similar, reactions from Palestinians in 1948, nor in the West Bank, to be precise. I mean, I'd like to get your views on this, because you were born inside the state of Israel as a Palestinian. You kind of lived that interaction with Israelis firsthand. But before I do, there's a lot of topical things that I really want to get your thoughts on. I'd like to get your thoughts on this transfer plan proposed by Trump recently in the last couple of weeks, that is making a lot of upheaval, in the political arena. So what does this plan mean, historically and ideologically for the state of Israel? I mean, how does it fit within the wider Israeli state policy towards the Palestinian population? And we're talking about a long history of that policy.
Thank you for these questions. And, you've asked two very big questions. So maybe I'll start by addressing Trump's recent plans and put them within a historical context, and then move to discuss what has happened in 48 Palestine and why we haven't seen a recurrence of the protest and the type of resistance that we saw in May 2021, why this time we haven't seen a recurrence of this protest. But let me start with Trump. Again, two really big questions. So, the plan for ethnic cleansing of Gaza did not start with Trump. It is quite incredible to see some of the liberal responses to Trump plan. We have seen, newspaper ads in Australia, in the US, by hundreds of, Jewish people opposing ethnic cleansing following Trump's plan. We've seen condemnation, at least at the level of, at least at the level of rhetoric, right? By world leaders, including, for example, the president of France, who asserted that Palestinians have the right to remain in Gaza. What is remarkable in these responses is that the plan to ethnically cleanse Palestinians and the intention to ethnically cleanse Palestinians in Gaza in this round since October 7th, 2023, since the beginning of the genocide, is not an idea that was pioneered by Trump. It was actually pioneered early on by former President Joe Biden, by the Liberal Democratic Party. And I think this is a piece of the puzzle that we keep forgetting, that it's not that kind of only within the, crazy far right spaces of Trump and the rise of fascism. It is also has been the intention of Joe Biden early in the war. If you recall, there were all these early in the war, early in the genocide, there were all these bits of news about the United States putting pressure on Egypt to evacuate, right, Palestinians to Egypt, to Sinai. And, part of it was pressure through, we know that Egypt has a massive debt, national debt, that it is one of the largest beneficiaries of US foreign aid. And they tried to leverage that to convince Egypt to accept, between 1 and 2 million Palestinians in its territories, effectively ethnically cleansing the population. So true. Biden didn't declare that, he will make a Trump Riviera out of Gaza, right? That kind of craziness. But it was the same plan, precisely the same plan. And since early in the genocide, we Palestinians have warned that it is not about Hamas, that it is about the expulsion of Palestinians, the elimination of Palestinians, making Gaza unlivable, destroying all means that sustain life, in order to empty Gaza of its Palestinian residents and to take over Gaza and make it, rebuild Israeli settlements and potentially annex it in the long run. So we need really to understand that the recent proposal by Trump is, as crazy as it may be, is quite the consensus in US politics, in US foreign affairs. And this is something to keep in mind. This is, this is a crazy idea, but it's not about the craziness of Trump. This has been at the forefront from early on in the genocide. Now, this goes back, obviously, to a much longer history in which transfer, ethnic cleansing, or what Fayez Sayer called racial elimination of Palestinians, the removal from their territories, has been, the bread and butter of the Zionist project. The Zionist project itself completely relies on project of ethnic cleansing. And, the Palestinian historian Noor Masalha, has a whole book from the 90s tracing the concept of transfer in, in the Zionist project and Zionist thought. This is not a new, this is, a continuation of decades long of population expulsion, of transfer, of emptying Palestine of its Palestinian inhabitants. And this is another episode in a much longer history. Now, what is interesting at this, particular historical moment is where, first of all, how further can Israel go, right? In its implementation of its plans, Israel and the United States. We know that this genocide is not only an Israeli endeavor. It's a genocide of Israel and the US done jointly with backup of other Western powers. But the question is, is it Palestinians have proved time and again that they are going to remain, that these projects are not going to erase Palestinian belonging to the land, Palestinian presence in the land. We all saw the, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians going back to north of Gaza, marching for hours, walking for hours, knowing that what they will arrive to is the rubble of their homes, where their loved ones are buried under, where there is no infrastructure to live. But they went back. They went back because it is their land, because what we know as Palestinian is Sumud. Now, we always talk about the right of return, right? We talk about al-Auda. But Palestinians have another aspect, a significant one, which would tie also to 48 Palestinian. And that is baqa, remaining. Auda and baqa, return and to remain, are at the core of the Palestinian struggle. It is part of how we survive in the land, how we keep the land, how we think about our relationship to the land. So yes, there are these plans. What will materialize? To what extent? I don't know. I honestly, I hope I hope I'm not wrong, but I just don't see these plans materializing. I see many other scenarios, but not that form of mass expulsion. But I might be wrong. I hope I'm not. Another question is, what role will Arab states, right, play in this? We all saw the really painful press conference of King Abdullah of Egypt and Trump. That was a painful watch. And we know from our history that we cannot rely on Arab states, that they may declare a particular, position and end up doing something different. At the end of the day, their interest is first and foremost is their own interests. It's not the Palestinian interest. And often they don't see those interests as aligning. Their people do see these interests as aligning, but not, not the rulers. So it will be interesting to see what is going to happen at the at the level of Arab states. And it will be interesting to see what is going to be happening at the level of, Israel and the US, and also in the mix, international institutions. We have the ICJ, we have the ICC, and it will be interesting to see how all these different factors are going to play out moving forward. And we are speaking at a very particular moment now where it's not clear whether the ceasefire is going to hold, mainly because Netanyahu is doing everything in his power um, um, to break and to violate the ceasefire by claiming that Hamas has violated the agreement. But we know that Israel has violated every aspect of the ceasefire agreement, from the number of, heavy equipment allowed into Gaza, through to the freezing of the release of prisoners. I mean, Hamas did release the bodies and did release Israeli captives, and Israel is still holding the hundreds, over 600 Palestinian prisoners that it was meant to release after the release of their hostages. And, many more violations. It is clear that Netanyahu has no interest to continue the ceasefire. So there are a lot of open questions, and it's clear what are the intentions of Israel and the US, but we also need to remember Palestinian agency here. And since the genocide, the people of Gaza have been teaching us sumud time and again, and have really shown what resistance look like in holding on to the land.
I totally agree. I mean, it's highly uncertain time. There's so many questions as to what's going to happen next. Are we going to go into the second phase? Are we going to go into the third phase? What's happening in the West Bank? We see an escalation of violence by the Israeli forces in the West Bank. So that's incredibly worrying. And talking about the Palestinian unity, who's going to be governing Gaza, these are all big questions as well, and because that's the only that's usually the pretext that Israel uses in terms of sustaining a ceasefire, that there's no one to negotiate with, and so on and so forth. Thanks for that really great analysis about this plan that goes decades and decades in history of transferring Palestinians, and about emphasizing the steadfastness and remaining al-baqa. It's a really interesting concept, especially for Palestinians in 1948, to do their best to maintain their grounds despite all the surveillance, all the Israeli belligerent policies against them. I would like you to kind of expand on these actions as well by the Israeli government against, the Palestinians inside the state of Israel, and just elaborate more about why aren't we seeing an outrage in the Palestinian community in there regarding what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank.
Thank you. Look, I don't think that there is no outrage among 48 Palestinians about what is happening in Gaza. I think there is a lot of outrage, and I think that there is a lot of pain. And I think that there is a huge one word that keeps, repeating itself. I see it, in the many social media posts of Palestinians in Israel, is, the helplessness and, that kind of recognition that we failed Gaza, right? So I wouldn't say that there is no outrage. What I would say is that yes, we haven't seen the scenes of May 21 of the Unity Intifada repeating. And I think that has to do with, again, the longer kind of history and specific circumstances of Palestinians in Israel. I'm not saying it as a justification or as an excuse, but as an explanation, um, or at least an attempt to understand, this particular response in this moment, which I can understand that is being seen as a form of silence, as not stepping up to that moment. And, immediately after October 7, many people had their eyes on 48ers, with the fresh memory of May 2021, of seeing tens of dozens of Palestinian cities and towns filling with, Palestinians resisting and protesting and confronting, Israeli police and Israeli military, and getting arrested in their masses and getting beaten and getting assaulted and getting lynched on the streets, uh, and we haven't seen these, this kind of mass popular protest and resistance happening despite the gravity of what is happening in Gaza. But I would argue that we haven't seen this happening, not despite, but because of the gravity of what was happening in Gaza. Now, that goes to understanding 48 Palestinians and kind of their history. So, they are the minority of Palestinians who somehow managed to remain in historic Palestine when the vast majority of Palestinians were expelled and made refugees. And, having seen the vast majority of their people becoming refugees and being disconnected geographically from their people and staying in Palestine, but also seeing Palestine turn into Israel as they stayed in it. They were placed under military rule, and their main, Adil Manna has a whole book on it, on al-Baqa, on the remaining. Their main goal was to remain, and to remain wasn't an easy task. It wasn't it sounds like a passive act, but it is not passive. It is very active, because if you didn't have an Israeli ID, if you didn't have an Israeli authorization, you were considered infiltrator and you were subject to deportation. I mean, that was the case of my grandfather, right? He was deported multiple times to Jenin and always making it back to 48, to his village. And that's the story of many other Palestinians. The very task of remaining was, it wasn't passive. It required a lot of effort to remain. And they did so while also resisting. I mean, from early on, Palestinians were, doing protests and distributing flyers and protesting land confiscation from 49 and 50, right? But really, the main thing that guided them is remaining in their homeland, not facing, not being deported and becoming refugees and becoming exiled from their homeland. And that took some compromises, right? They had accepted being citizens in the state that dispossessed them, in the state that is colonizing them, that is occupying their land, that is putting them under military. And, it was a complicated form of being where they needed to adjust to make the transition from being Palestinians, yes, under, first under the Ottomans and then under, British mandate, and then becoming, being Palestinians, becoming a minority. And I'm not talking here in the sense of minoritizing, but really in terms of, their experience was we were the majority that was our land, and suddenly we remained this, a small minority. Obviously, they're not a minority in the sense of minoritization, right? But that was how they experienced what they experienced. Now, fast forward historically, May 2021 was not the first moment in which 48 Palestinians had popular protests on mass scale, which, coincided also with mass protests in other parts of historic Palestine. So I'm thinking here about Land Day, right? And I'm thinking here about October 2000. Again, starting in Gaza, Hamad al-Durra, and you know, and and spreading. And so, these mass protests that we saw in May 2021 were part of a much larger history. And it's quite remarkable in May 2021, that kind of unity that we saw that was so inspiring. Seeing Palestinians, mobilizing in unison across historic Palestine, in the Shatat, in the diaspora. And it was a really inspiring moment because we came together under, a banner of Palestinian liberation and under a banner of Palestinian peoplehood, right? So 48ers didn't protest as citizens. They protested as Palestinians seeking liberation, part of, the Palestinian people seeking liberation. It was a different kind of political sensibility. But also what happened in May 2021 was the settlers' attacks on Palestinian towns and cities and families. We saw the footages, the lynches in the streets, marking with laser tags Palestinian homes to set on fire, even breaking into Palestinian homes and beating up, household members in their homes. The sense of insecurity was massive. And then we saw Palestinians, especially in what they call mixed cities, right, which are basically Palestinian cities, but that have now also a large Israeli population in them. And so, we saw this violence in Led, in Jaffa, in Akka, in Haifa. Those were the places with, very high levels, Nasri, very high levels of violence. And the one thing that this moment also reminded was of the Nakba, right? Because Palestinians had to self-organize, with the police acting against them and operating in cahoots with Israeli settlers. Palestinians self-organized to defend themselves. So the Shabab, took to the streets and they protected mosques and they protected homes. And there was one of those young people, Tamer Abu Kishik from Led. So he went to protect the city's mosque, and he said, and I do want to quote him. He said, "It looks like I won't be returning home today. Either I come back in a burial cloth, or I don't know what my fate holds. This is their attempt to kick us out of Lid, to implement another massacre," right? So, that was, we're not going to let them we're not going to let them kick us out of Lid. We're going to remain Baqa, right? And then we have 2.5 years later, after the Unity Intifada, the genocide in Gaza, right? And, the images that were coming out of Gaza were one of Nakba, right? We all we know that the Nakba is continuing, it never ended, but there are those, moments of kind of spectacular violence of Nakba, right? That was one moment. They saw the massacres, the field executions, the starvation, people fleeing their homes in their masses, destruction of whole neighborhoods. So people don't have homes to return to. We've already seen that in the past. and the shooting, of those who do try to return. So it is in this context that the scenes of May 2021 were not repeated. Going back to what I said, they weren't repeated not despite of what was happening in Gaza, but because of what was happening in Gaza. So one, 48 Palestinian activists said this is a mark of shame that we'll have to live with, our silence. But also remember that, when October 7th happened and the weeks after, Israel really intensified its crackdown on Palestinians in Israel in really significant way. So even post expressing sadness over a killed child was seen as incitement to terror. We've
On social
seen
media.
on social media, sorry. Yeah. So we've seen doctors, being dismissed of their work. We've seen students in universities facing expulsion, tens of students. We've seen Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian being arrested over her, her academic work on Palestinian children. She was a professor in Israeli university. She has left since. We've seen people getting arrested over posts on social media, very simple posts. Some people had settlers attack their homes or looking for them in their homes or protesting in front of their homes. The crackdown was really significant and massive. And I'll finish here, but you know, it is the Nakba that is the thread that explains, on the one hand, the Unity Intifada in May 2021, and which was, the popular uprising that we've seen, but also the paralysis that we've seen in May, in the genocide in Gaza. And 48 Palestinians they know very well that if, their citizenship offers very limited protection, that if Israel gets the opportunity to expel them, it will do so. That their neighbors will take part of their expulsion, that their neighbors will turn on them. So again, understanding 48 Palestinians is understanding that always what kind of really guides them and kind of it's in between the trauma and the political commitment is really remaining. And I want to, finish this with a quote from a piece that Abed Abu Shadi from Yafa, he's, an activist and a public figure, wrote, and I'm quoting, "In the annihilation of Gaza, we see a vision of our future as Palestinians inside Israel. We cannot help but wonder, what will they do to us? Maybe they'll put us in a ghetto like they did after 1948. On TikTok, we see our Jewish Israeli neighbors destroying Gaza, abusing and humiliating Palestinians, expressions of unrestrained evil that are not even met with a whisper of protest from Israeli society. As dystopian as it sounds, these images are our future captured on film." So it's, again, not justification, but it is an attempt of explaining a bit of, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a political scientist, but really we need to understand the deep trauma and the deep anxiety and the deep fear. It is not paranoia. And Gaza has, proved that it's not paranoia. Israel will do whatever it takes to get rid of Palestinians. And now it is scarier than ever because they know that no one is going to stop them. I don't think that they imagine that they will be allowed to go so far. And there is nothing scarier than seeing, Israel operating with a sense, it's even more than impunity, this sense that there are no boundaries. So we now see the next step, which is the mass expulsions that we're now seeing in the West Bank, Tulkarem, Jenin, and elsewhere. Already over 40 Palestinians expelled in the last month. So, with again, expelled not temporarily, right? We're seeing ethnic cleansing happening. All the infrastructure in the camps is being destroyed. The same textbook of Gaza, destroying to make the place unlivable, unsustainable for human life.
It's also incredibly sobering, the narrative within the Israeli society inside Israel, as Haim Rashid Stabner mentioned the other day. It's a democratic genocide that Israel is actually perpetrating in Gaza. There's a consensus, almost more than 96% of the Israeli society. They agree that either they agree with the amount of force exerted on Israel, on Gaza by Israel, or it's actually they're saying that it's not enough. And it's interesting to hear these comments coming from Palestinians inside Israel, that they can see their future in what's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza. Such an alarming things to say. It goes into this campaign of intimidation and fear against the Palestinians inside Israel. But I can't help but wondering, for example, there's a number of journalists, Israeli Jewish journalists, who are kind of outspoken in the media. They write articles in Haaretz, for example, Gideon Levy and all other journalists. Does it go to the concept of this racial discrimination between Israelis with Palestinian background and Israeli Jewish when it comes to speaking out or publishing articles about what's happening in Gaza? Like, why do we see these articles coming out or allowed to be published by Israeli Jewish citizens in Israel, and not anything allowed, even, liking a post on social media by Israelis from Palestinian background? I've always been wrestling with this question, like if you have any insight on this.
Look, I'm not a big fan of Haaretz, right? Like the liberal newspaper. Probably Haaretz will be among, national newspapers and news outlets, will be the only outlet where, yes, 48 Palestinians publish against the genocide. So there is that. So that's, happening there. And again, it is kind of part of the liberal Zionist facade that newspapers like Haaretz need to hold, while, by and large, they are facilitating the genocide and have been also providing the kind of liberal ideological cover for the genocide. So there's that. Obviously, they're not gonna get any, Palestinians are not gonna get any opportunity to write, against the genocide or protest Israeli actions in any other Israeli newspaper. And I just saw actually a few hours ago that the Israeli Journalist Association, or maybe it's not the journalists, one of the media associations, has opened an investigation against the Palestinian journalist who interviewed to a Palestinian outlet, right? So it's really about limiting expressions that at Haaretz, it could happen because it has the liberal Zionist cover to it, right? Protection. But when Palestinians decide to act independently of these spaces, then the crackdown is much more intense. I'm going to give it's not journalists, but I'm going to give you an example from the last 48 hours. Okay. So Palestinian comedian Nidal Badani, right? He has uh, a new comedy show, um, you know, post October 2023. And actually, I saw segments like, stuff that he's put on social media. It's quite funny, I have to admit. His new show is sold out, right? But he can't do his show. So his show was booked in a venue in Haifa, and the police threatened the venue in Haifa. I think even a couple of venues in Haifa from hosting the show, and he had to cancel that show. Then he shifted after I think he had like 2, 3 venues. Then he shifted to a venue in Nasr, in Nazareth. And they called again, the police called the venue and threatened the venue. And then they called Nidal, the comedians, and they threatened him as well. Basically, they threatened that they'll, have one of the criminal gangs settle score with him. Few hours later, the police raided his house and arrested him. He's since been released with no, obviously there's nothing to arrest him for, but that's part of the environment that exists. That's the landscape in which 48 Palestinians now live. So this is just kind of an example of the really deep political repression that exists. And when Palestinians act autonomously, the crackdown is much more significant and severe. And we've seen that also on, protests that Palestinians try to organize. They'll try to come to the protest, but there's, everything is closed by hundreds of, police and security forces and armed vehicles and horses, police horses, and, preventing them from being able to demonstrate even before the demonstration has happened. Now, they found ways to subvert this, but this is by and large the environment, the landscape in 48 Palestine.
I want to zoom out on this particular topic to include the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. You mentioned in your one of your published papers a quote from Professor Rashid Al-Khalidi, and I want to read that quote because it's interesting. It says, Israel has taken the traditional approaches of isolation, containment, and control to new heights. In short, this is a vast carceral edifice. Can you explain and expand on that? What did you mean by that, and why did you decide to quote Rashid Khadi on this particular topic in talking about incarceration system? Because I did ask that question to Abdul Jawad Omar when we had him on a couple of weeks ago. We saw what's happening in Gaza. We saw Operation October the 7th, and what Hamas did. This one of the main reasons and demands by Hamas was prisoners exchanged. And so what is so special, what is so important about the aspect of prisoners in the Palestinian psyche and in Hamas that is, they sacrificed the utter and complete destruction of Gaza for that being one of the purposes or one of the demands for that operation. So could you, I know it's a big question as well, I'm expanding a lot, but could you elaborate on this incarceration of Palestine, the system of incarceration?
So thank you for this question. Maybe I'll put a bit in perspective what the piece was about. So it was a piece that I wrote with my sister, Lana Tatour, who is, well, she's a human rights activist lawyer. She was during the Unity Intifada, she was part of a group of You know, young women, lawyers or with legal background who are providing support to detainees. As we know, Israel has, you know, mass arrested then Palestinians, 48 Palestinians, not only also in East Jerusalem. And this paper was trying to capture, you know, that particular story of May 2021. Part of it also speaking about, you know, mass arrests as this kind of colonial technology of disciplining and containment, but also really documenting a lot of the amazing activism that happens on the ground that often goes undocumented. So it was part of, you know, creating that archive. And, you know, that quote by Professor Rashid Khalid, it really, you know, it struck a chord because the settler state, and certainly the Israeli settler state, but not only, you know, even Australia as well, we know it, is a carceral state. It's a defining feature, one of the defining features of settler states and the way, you know, they behave with, and their, you know, their policies towards kind of surplus or unwanted populations, right, as a way to manage population. And we see, you know, the carceral state is not just about prisons, it's also about prisons. But in Palestine, you see it in particular. It's kind of, you know, it really embodies the idea of carceral state. You see it in checkpoints, whether they're manned or, you know, roadblocks. You see it in the apartheid wall. You know, the separation wall that, you know, when you see it in your eyes, it runs across, you know, it cuts in the middle roads and villages and cities. It's a monster. And you see it, you know, you see it in so many different ways that Palestinian lives that carceral, not just logic, but infrastructure every minute, really every minute. I mean, the whole idea of settlements and the way settlements build, you know, on hilltops, right, in the West Bank or in 48 Palestine, like, you know, Nazareth Elite, now Nova Galil, is structured, you know, was put above Nazareth. And, you know, many other Jewish settlements, this is how they built, really embodying this kind of carceral racial logic. So Palestinians really live that carcerality, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's in imprisonment, day in and day out. And when it comes, and it's important, yes, to talk about prisoners, right? You know, that kind of more classic form of carcerality. Since 1967, over 1 million Palestinians were in Israeli jail, were prisoned. I mean, I want to repeat that figure. 1 million. We don't have the figures for the period between 1948 and 1967, which would be high as well. 1 million. I mean, that means that at every moment, we have thousands of Palestinians incarcerated in Israeli jail. There is not a single Palestinian family, definitely in the West Bank and Gaza, that doesn't have a member of their family that has, you know, run through, that was in Israeli jail, one way or another. The question of prisoners, of political prisoners, is at the heart of the Palestinian struggle. It is unacknowledged, But we know as Palestinians, I mean, you just need to know the Palestinian struggle to know that it is at the heart of the struggle. It is our people incarcerated in the prisons of our colonizers, of our occupiers, being tortured, being denied freedom, being denied medical treatment, being denied dignity, being away from their families because they are committed to the liberation of their people, to the liberation of themselves, because they want to live in dignity. Every Palestinian community has many members in Israeli jails. This is part of the personal story of every Palestinian. Every Palestinian. This is a core to the Palestinian struggle. Again, and I want to acknowledge that those who have been most, subject to this is Palestinians in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And nothing like this particular moment has brought to the front the deep anti-Palestinian racism that refuses to see our prisoners as captives. They're captives. They've been in captivity. They're hostages.
Many of
Actually,
them
they're
without
not
even
captives.
charge.
They're not captives of war. Israeli soldiers are captives of war. Sorry, I mixed the terminology. They're, they're being kidnapped. Literally, Palestinians are being kidnapped day in and day out. Every day, Palestinians are being kidnapped by Israelis. Yet, Israelis are considered hostages. And, the existence of 200 plus Israeli hostages, some of them, by the way, are captives of war because they're soldiers. The civilians are hostages. Their freedom is regarded as of higher value than the freedom of our people. There is a clear racial hierarchy there, a very clear racial hierarchy. No one sees our pain. No one sees our desire for freedom. Just look at the front pages of Western newspapers to see the deep racism in the, value of life they ascribe to Jews, to Israeli Jews versus Palestinians. Now, everyone deserves to be home, but no one, they don't deserve to be home more than us. We deserve to be home. At the end of this exchange deal, if it's going to be seen through, there will be no more Israeli captives or hostages in the hands of Palestinians, but there will remain thousands of Palestinian hostages in the hands of Israel. And no one, the international community, is not going to be demanding the release. There isn't going to be the outrage and the outcry over the thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails. And, it's the racism that we are facing. Really racism, the racism that allows the killing of nearly 20,000 children without the outrage, right? But actually seeing them as, 20,000 as collateral damage.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned at the beginning, it goes back to the nature of this system as a settler colonial system akin to where we live here on this colony. We see the children incarceration of First Nation people, through the roof, the numbers. It's quite fascinating when you look at it from that perspective.
Absolutely. And I think this is a really crucial point.
Yes.
We see that carcerality here, and actually more First Nation children are incarcerated and out of home today than even was during the period of the stolen generations. And somehow this is not, again, this is not something generating the outrage that it should. And speaking again to the, to the racial structure of settler colonial states and their carceral logic and who's and kind of the eliminatory work that these practices are doing.
100%. I want to expand, talking about us and living on this colony. I want to expand this conversation and talk about our responsibility as Palestinians living in the diaspora towards what's happening right now back home in Palestine. Especially in light of, this campaign of intimidation against pro-Palestine communities. We just woke up to the news that about 39 universities adopted this definition of, I would call it anti-Israel definition. A large part of it is trying to silence, the conversation around criticizing the state of Israel and what it's doing. I really want to get your thoughts on that particular point.
Depressing times.
Especially
I mean,
because you also, teach at University of New South Wales. So this is going to be very, very impactful on you.
Let's set back the question. So there's the first part, which is our role as diaspora. And our role as diaspora is to create pressure and, center the Palestinian cause and build up support for the Palestinian cause as much as possible and supporting, people on the ground in Palestine, wherever they may be. And I think that, by and large, we've been doing the labor. The movement has been growing, the rallies, the lobby work that is being done, expanding bases of support. A lot is being done. I mean, just look at you, an enterprise of, one man and all this kind of community work that community and public work that you've been doing and many others. So and yet we feel helpless, and for good reason, right? We keep saying, we failed Gaza, we failed to end this genocide. But in many ways, I also want to say that, we're trying. We've been trying. We've been trying. We didn't stand aside when, seeing the assault. I want to move now to the new definition on anti-Semitism that you referred to, that universities, that was announced this morning that universities have adopted in Australia, and maybe put it in a bit of perspective for non-Australian audiences. So like in other places around the world, there was a push which precedes, October 2023, of a pressure on universities to adopt the IHRA. In Australia, the vast majority of universities have refused to adopt the IHRA. Really, only a handful of universities did. They did acknowledge the risks it poses to academic freedom and freedom of expression on campuses. They saw there was enough evidence by then from, the UK and elsewhere to show that this definition is problematic, that there is no consensus around it, and that its real intention is to limit criticism of Israel and Zionism. So universities were tuned to this critique, and really many universities did. Most universities refused to adopt it, arguing that their anti-racism policies and also existing laws provide sufficient protection, and that there is no specific justification or reason for exceptional treatment in the form of a designated definition of anti-Semitism in universities.
Just to interrupt very quickly, Lana, for those who don't understand what the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, I think it's a controversial definition whose author actually came out against it, Kenneth Stern, and he wrote a very popular article saying that it was not supposed to be adopted as a policy of any country or any state or any university. But it was meant to be used for polling or statistics and so on and so forth. And it's got 7 examples of the 11th of examples of anti-Semitism is criticism of Israel as a state. So yeah, apologies to interrupt, but it's just for everyone who doesn't know what IHRA is.
Yeah, thanks for this. So, the IHRA definition is definitely a controversial definition. And, as you mentioned, it gives 11 illustrative examples. 7 of them relate directly to Israel. So it's really tying anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. So, for example, if you say that Israel is a racist state or a racist endeavor, according to the definition, that would qualify as anti-Semitism. So based on that, calling Israel an apartheid state or a settler colonial state is anti-Semitism. And there is really enough evidence to establish the political intentions behind it, which has less to do with protecting Jewish people from anti-Semitism and more to do with protecting Israel from criticism. And now, as I mentioned, Australian universities the vast majority have refused to adopt the definition. And what we've seen since October is Zionist groups and, Zionist politicians. And here I'm going to say, by Zionist, it's everyone who supports Zionism. They could be Jewish or non-Jewish, and we see that in politicians who are declare themselves as staunch Zionists and supporters of the Zionist project. So it is not a replacement for the word Jewish. It is an actual commitment to to an ideology, a racist colonial ideology, to be precise. So what we've seen is Zionist politicians and civil society starting to mobilize at the political level to create basically political pressure on universities, so pressure from above. Unfortunately, so that included 2 parliamentary inquiries into anti-Semitism at Australian universities. The second one, the report was released just a couple of weeks ago. This has included the appointment of a special envoy on anti-Semitism, who was also the former president of ACAJ, which is the main Zionist organization in Australia. And this has included, the student ombudsman, which is not designated only to this cause, but will have an impact for us as well. And the student ombudsman has adopted the IHRA as well. And it included a pressure on universities. So I'll add, there is a threat of judicial inquiry, which universities are trying to avoid. And it's important to note, that the Liberals have already stated, and for non-Australian audiences, the Liberals is like the Conservative Party, right? Have stated that if they win the elections, which is probably in a couple of months' time, likely in April, they will establish a judicial inquiry and legislate the IHRA into law. How does that relate to the definition that you've mentioned earlier? Is that the Go8, which is a consortium of the leading universities in Australia that includes eight universities, worked with the envoy on anti-Semitism to create own definition of anti-Semitism. Okay? Some would argue that this definition is akin to the IHRA definition. I would argue that it is much worse than the IHRA definition. And I want to read a couple of, I have it in front of me. It was sent to me today. I want to read a couple of, so you know what is being discussed. So one of them is criticism of the policies and practices of the Israeli government or state is not in and of itself anti-Semitic. However, criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitic when it's grounded in harmful tropes, stereotypes, or assumptions, and when it calls for the elimination of the state of Israel or all Jews. This is the exceptionalism. No state has right to exist. People have right to exist. People have rights. States is a modern constellation. I'm speaking here as an academic, as a political scientist. It's a modern phenomenon. You can, oppose the existing of states. You can argue for the dismantlement of state. We have anarchism. But more than anything, what does it mean to say? I mean, no one is talking about the elimination of the state of Israel. Elimination is a genocidal language it's a wrong language. But we could say that what we want to see between the river and the sea is an equal polity, a state that is based on equality rather than on a racial regime that provides and guarantees equality to all people living in that territory. They could be Arabs, they could be Jews, they could be migrants, but a polity that is based on equality. Now, that is it elimination of the state of Israel? Right? I mean, so what we see is this kind of terminology that is really aiming to prevent any thinking about the political future of this land between the river and the sea, preventing us from imagining alternatives to what the international community has determined to be an apartheid regime, a racial regime of discrimination. Within that, so calling from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free or free Palestine, is anti-Semitic. Calling the dismantlement of the Zionist regime may be interpreted as anti-Semitic. Now, I can call for the dismantlement of, the Australian state. Its return, that's part of political debate. But this, the specific choice of elimination of the state of Israel really exemplifies the way that they are thinking. And they're projecting their genocidal convictions and their genocidal thinking on us. We don't speak in terms of elimination. We are speaking in terms of liberation. We are speaking in terms of equality and dignity for all. They're speaking a language that is genocidal, a language of racial superiority, a language of Jewish supremacy. And what this is doing, that phrasing, is a protection of a colonial racial supremacist regime and preventing us from thinking about how we can transform that regime. When Amnesty International says we need to dismantle apartheid, we need an end to apartheid, is that an elimination? Is that elimination? It is not. Second, the definition goes a step further in trying to enshrine Zionism as a protected identity. Now, let's be clear. Zionism is not a protected identity. Zionism is an ideology. It's the belief that Jewish people have the right to a state in Palestine, right? On the expense of Palestinians. So here, there is an attempt to say that, no, it is an identity. And actually, when you say Zionists, which go back to what I said before, right? Then you mean Jews. And actually, what you're doing is anti-Semitic act against Jews. So one of the second thing that the definition is saying is all people, including Jews, have the right to self-determination. Now, obviously, this definition excludes Palestinian from the right to self-determination, right? For most, but not all Jewish Australians, Zionism is a core part of their Jewish identity. Substituting the word Zionist for Jew does not eliminate the possibility of speech being anti-Semitic, end of quote.
Mm.
This definition is worse than the IHRA. It is a step ahead of the IHRA. And it is the logic that guides it is very dangerous. And it is very concerning that our universities thought that it was, fit for your university context when we are in the classroom where we, where we research, where we teach, where we think, when we need to break boundaries, when we need to think creatively, that's a fitting definition in a university setting. It's the same universities that refused to adopt the IHRA because of a risk to academic freedom that is now adopting a definition that is far more worse than the IHRA, that will limit further academic freedom and freedom of speech and expression on campuses and right to protest.
Absolutely. It's incredibly concerning coming at this time. So, I mean, my last question to you on this topic, Lana, is there some sort of an appeal that can be done to prevent this from being legislated as a solid law at universities? Or is this kind of final and we can't do anything about it?
I think that it now, obviously, we need to express our deep opposition and concern to the definition. This has happened today, and I estimate that in the next few weeks, you will see concerted campaign against this definition and warning against the risk it poses to academic freedom. One of the questions that now remain is, how will universities interpret and apply this definition? And here, every universities will be a different ballgame, right? So some universities may adopt it into their formal policies in assessing complaints. Some universities may do what they did with the IHRA, which is not adopt it, but put it in the appendix of their anti-racism policy, which is what Sydney Uni and UNSW did. But that definition doesn't define or guide misconduct investigations. There are different scenarios as to what will happen with this. And it really will depend on political pressure, on what individual universities will be doing with this definition. How much are they, and how much they're going to be incorporating it into their operation.
Mm.
And again,
Finally,
I think the elections, sorry, and I think the elections are going to be, I mean, don't get me wrong, labor has been absolutely horrendous, and this is happening because of labor. This is happening under labor, which is absolutely horrendous. But the elections will also change the landscape. So the question is whether the liberal will deliver on their promises to the Zionist lobby around judicial inquiry and legislating basically the IHRA. And that will be then, again, a different landscape.
yeah, it's even the political system is pretty precarious at the moment. We don't know whether the Labour will continue, or are we going to get a new liberal, conservative, staunch Zionist government, kind of like the situation was in the US leading up to the election a few months back. Lana, I can't thank you enough for this really rich insight into what's happening back home and what's happening here, and what our duty is as Palestinian diaspora. So thanks again for your time, and hopefully we can have more conversation into the future about topical things that are happening around us.
Thanks so much for having me, and يعطيك ألف عافية.
Allah يعافيك.